Okay, hi everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining us today for the Becker Friedman Institute's Friedman Forum featuring Erik Hurst. My name is Sam Ori and I'm the Executive Director at BFI. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, BFI is a collaborative platform for the vast and very diverse Chicago economics community that includes over 250 economists at Booth, the Harris School, the Law School, and here in the Economics Department. A big part of what we do is to invest in fostering new research in that community, but we also really work hard to share the findings and the insights from researchers with the campus community through events like this, and then beyond the campus, beyond UChicago, through outreach and communications. And so we're really excited to have you all here today for this talk by Erik. And I will, with that, go ahead and introduce Erik. He's the Deputy Director of BFI, I should mention. Erik is the V. Duane Rath Professor of Economics and the John E. Juke Faculty Fellow at Booth and at the University of Chicago, at University of Chicago Booth School of Business, and is the Deputy Director of BFI, as I already mentioned. He is a macroeconomist whose work focuses on housing markets, labor markets, and household financial behavior. One strand of his research explores the importance of home production in determining time series, life cycle, and business cycle variation in measured consumption and spending. I'm not sure.
You can move it around.
Yeah, that's all perfect. Way over my head. His work on these issues has been extensively covered in the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Economist, and so we're very fortunate to hear Erik's talk today on the effects of technology on the employment of young men and women. So with that, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. This good? I'm hearing a little feedback. Is that okay? Okay, perfect. So first I recommend the cookie in the box. That was a very tasty cookie. I'm going to take another before I leave. So here's things I've been thinking about lately. So what I'm going to show you here is the annual hours worked of men 21 to 55 since about the late 1970s through today. I'm getting really bad feedback. Is that something that's normal? I got to just walk away from the things? I'll walk over here. I got to walk when I talk. I'm still getting a little bit. So what you're seeing here is normally, again, for men who are, I'm going to use the word prime age, basically post-undergraduate, when we start thinking about retirement, you're seeing about 1,950 hours per year worked. And it's about 40 hours a week for about 50 weeks a year. That's about the average. Starting in about 2000, you see this number falling. Currently, this is as of the most recent data, so 2017 data, asking people how much they work in 2016. That number is about 1,800, a little under 1,800 hours per year. So when you hear the newspaper telling us that the unemployment rate is back to normal relative to the pre-recession period, that is a true statement. But hours worked is well below trend where we were in the 2000s, and still well below where we were at the beginning of the recession. Now, how do those two facts reconcile with each other? Well, almost all of this decline in hours worked is due to declining employment rates of this group. This group is not working. But I just told you the unemployment rate is pretty low. So how do you reconcile those? The unemployment rate only measures those people who aren't working but are actively looking for a job. There is now a large swath of prime age men who are now not working and not looking for a job. This decline is massive in magnitude. Think about the 1982 recession. That was a relatively bad recession in the United States. The movement in hours worked during that recession is an order of magnitude smaller than the decline we've had over the last 17 years in hours worked. Now, that's not to say that there's not business cycle variation. When we go into recessions, we work less than at booms. But in a period where we're now 10 years removed from the last recession, we are still almost 200 hours per week working less for prime age men. And these declines are most pronounced for those members of us with lower amounts of accumulated schooling. So I'm showing you this picture here. It has 3 lines. Those with a bachelor's degree or more, that's up top. Those with a high school degree or less, that's kind of in the middle. and then some college. That means people who basically step on a college campus. They might get an associate's degree, they might drop out, but they don't matriculate to a bachelor's degree on a campus. And it's roughly about a third and a third in each of these groups in current periods. And this is just in the back of your mind. I always like to stress this when I'm doing these things. For those people who are actually getting a bachelor's degree, you are rare relative to society. It's only about a third of all young men are getting, or men are getting a bachelor's degree. A little bit higher for women, about 38% for women. But this is nowhere near the median getting a bachelor's degree. But the key thing I want to say is the declines are even bigger. Okay, almost 100 hours a year bigger for those with less amounts of schooling than those relative to with a bachelor's degree or more. This picture blows my mind every time I see it, which is, and I made it too, and it still does it. What it is here is you're taking a look at the fraction of each group now, again, men 21 to 55, by skill, who report working 0 weeks during the prior year. So we have household surveys that say, hey, you working? You say no. And they say, how much you work last year? How many weeks? And they say none. And what I'm tracking here is the fraction who say they work 0 weeks between over the prior calendar year. That number historically was about 9% or so, a little less than 9% for those prime age men with a high school degree or less. That number is currently 1/5. So 1 out of 5 men with a high school degree or less, that's about 30% of this group, is now sitting idle for a whole year. That is a staggering number, and I want you to focus on the trends in this. It was increasing during the recession, prior to the recession, increased dramatically during the recession, and there's been very little rebound during this time period. Okay? Let me say one more thing and I'll take questions. I want you guys to ask questions along the way. This pattern doesn't look any different or only slightly different if I throw out people who go to schooling. So these are people who are non-working, non-student pictures. What was your question, man?
Yeah, that was exactly.
Of course, I know it would. I'm a veteran. I knew it was coming. Okay. So, but that's exactly. So how do we think about students? So students does maybe about 1.5 to 2 percentage points of some of these pictures. I'm going to show you the same thing by young men, and that's where it's going to be in a second. For young men, it's about 1 and 2 percentage points is due to schooling. So what I'm showing you here now is the same picture, again, for men, and percentage changes in hours work. So instead of levels, which I showed you before, you should think about these log deviations or percentage changes and declines. For men 21 to 30, relative to men 31 to 55, conditional on having less than a bachelor's degree, just to have some low levels of schooling. And you should see this is your group, young men, are now reducing their hours by almost 25%, or at least 24-hour log points during this time period. Now, some of that, about 3 to 4 log points, and about 2 percentage points in the next picture I show you, is going back to schooling. But even with that, there is a massive decline for young men relative to older men. And that is puzzling for us, because usually when the stories I tell you about why people work less, the young tend to be the most elastic. If a sector goes away and that hurts old people, the young move to new sectors. So the fact we're seeing this persistent decline in hours worked, again, almost all of it due to declining employment rates, is puzzling in this dimension. And here's just the same, I took out the other ones. Let me just show you now the patterns for women. So why do we break out patterns for men versus women separately? Because there's been a secular increase in employment for women for almost a century or so in the United States. So from basically 1900 to 2000, women's participation rate, their market work, has been increasingly steadily, aside from a period right around World War II, where women entered and then retreated slightly after World War II. The 2000s are remarkably different for women, and it's the first decade over decade that isn't World War II decline in employment rates and hours worked for women with less than a bachelor's degree. So you're seeing now women actually retrenching, less educated women retrenching from the labor market like their male counterparts, which is a stark deviation from trend over the last century. Women with a bachelor's degree or more, many of you soon to be in this room, you can see very little trend in hours for that group. Okay. So the question I want to talk about today and try to give you some of my thoughts on, which is a body of work I've been working on over a series of different individual research projects, is what is the role of technology in explaining these patterns we're seeing. And I'm going to focus on two things. And I'm going to show you evidence that I think both are important in the data. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is technology's role on labor demand. So what does that mean? Well, certain things like automation comes along, and we replace workers with robots. And for certain types of workers, they are having trouble adjusting. And in that world, you'll see like a decline in the demand for labor for certain types of workers. And when the labor demand falls, that's going to put downward pressure on wages and downward pressure on employment rates. So technology is having some effect on labor demand. The second thing, and I'm going to show you a bunch of evidence for that, particularly viewed through the lens of the manufacturing sector in the economy. And then the second thing we're going to talk about is technology's role on labor supply. Now, what does that mean? When you make a decision to work, you're deciding the benefits from work, which is usually the wage you get that you could buy stuff with the cost of work, which is you give up leisure in order to go and take some work. And you're going to compare this market wage to what we refer to as like a reservation wage, the outside option that it's going to take you to get in order to get you off the couch to work. And technology also might have an effect on that reservation wage. How? Because increases in leisure technology, things like video games and social media, have made a unit of leisure time cheaper per unit of utility than it did in the past. Okay? It is relatively cheap to do social media, but people tend to allocate a lot of time to that. So how does an increase in the reservation wages affect labor supply? So technology, again, having an effect on market wages through its effect on labor demand, technology having its effect on reservation wages through its effect on labor supply. And that's what I want to frame our discussion today. So let's take them in turn. So I'm going to do a first few minutes on the labor demand side, and then we'll do some more on the labor supply side. Yeah, what do you got, man?
I'm trying to wrap my head around the numbers, but like the first thing that strikes me is that the declining labor supply is most likely an intensive margin adjustment because people still need to work enough to eat, even if they like video games. Well, the labor demand could be an extensive margin adjustment of there just not being jobs. So
I think you're half right. Okay. What do I mean by half right? That both labor demand and labor supply stories, in order, when we think about how they affect, that translates into people's work intensity, there's also an income effect that we need to think about. The margin of utility of consumption at zero income is approximately infinite. So that's going to encourage people to go and work in sectors that they might normally not choose to so they don't starve. And that happens both for labor demand and labor supply. So how do we think about people eating when they're not working? And I'll talk about that throughout, but you're going to see there are certain types of transfer programs, particularly I'm going to show you some stuff with the labor demand, that provided by the government that might actually ensure people's consumption to some extent when they're not working. And on the labor supply side, there is also insurance. Not so much from the government, but from your parents. And I'm going to show you that for the young men and women, that parents are providing some insurance during their period of not working. And in that type of a scenario, you could have shifts in labor supply with insurance provided by parents, and you could get declines in market work. And we'll talk about both of those insurance effects as we go through. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about technology's effect on labor demand. And so why do I start with labor demand? The labor supply stuff is fun. People like it when I come out and talk about video games' effects on labor supply. I think labor demand is more important. So why do I think labor demand is more important? Because I could go to the data and disentangle the net effect on labor demand from labor supply by looking at wages. We know that a decline in labor demand puts downward pressure on wages. A decline in labor supply puts upward pressure on wages. So let's go to the data and see what's happening to wages during this period, and they are actually falling. So what I'm showing you here is a picture of real wages of what I'm going to refer to as men with less than a bachelor's degree, and I've done it by age younger being 21 to 30, older being 31 to 55, and you could see for both groups the decline in real wages that occurred during the 2000s, consistent with a decline in labor demand. And if I showed you for higher skilled workers, our wage declines aren't that much. If anything, our wages are going up during this period. But the real wages of those with less than a bachelor's degree is actually falling. And this is the inequality stuff you hear in the newspaper. The wages of us is going up. The wages of those with a bachelor's degree or less is going down. And there's a growing gap in the earnings of workers with and without skill, or accumulated skill measured by education. So this tells me, if I was detective working around, that labor demand is a primary candidate to explain the patterns in the data. So the focus on labor demand I'm going to talk about today, and this is a bunch of my new recent work, is talking about the role of the manufacturing sector as a primary sector that was employing workers with lower years of accumulated schooling. And before I show you some of those facts, let me just tell you what has happened to the manufacturing sector over the last 40-some years in the United States. So this is just government data. You click on the Bureau of Labor Statistics website in the United States, and you could just download the amount of people working in manufacturing in any given month. So the number over there, the early periods, about 18 million workers in the US were working in manufacturing. That number fell during the 1980s and 1990s by about 2 million. So we were losing auto jobs to Japan. That is what we were talking about a 2 million decline in manufacturing in the United States during the 80s and 90s. From 2000 to 2004, we lost about 4 million manufacturing jobs in the United States in a 4-year period. The Great Recession comes along and wipes out another 3.5 million jobs in manufacturing. And when people talk about the rebound of the manufacturing sector in terms of employment, this is what they're talking about. Okay? It has gone up by maybe about 500,000 jobs. But on net, we are down about 7.5 million jobs in manufacturing during this time period. There are 2 stories for why this occurred. I think they are interrelated, and one is not reversible. Story 1, and this is something you hear in the newspaper even as of yesterday, that import competition from the rest of the world, particularly even China, as China grows, manufacturing jobs in the United States fall because now instead of producing stuff in the United States and consuming it in the United States, things are produced in China and then consumed in the United States. And as a result, less manufactured production occurs in the United States relative to the rest of the world. And we just import goods in from the rest of the world. China entering the World Trade Organization right around 2000 had a big effect on manufacturing employment in the United States. That's story 1. Story 2 is around the same time, the manufacturing sector has become more automated. Technology has changed such that when we produce a given unit of manufactured goods in the United States, we now do it more with machines and less than with workers than we did in the past. So these 2 stories are going on, and they could be causal. Import competition from China could have caused the manufacturing firms to try to be more competitive, and they do so by moving to cheaper robots away from more expensive workers. Now, even policy that we heard yesterday, where people want to think about putting tariffs on imports from the rest of the world for manufacturing goods, like steel and aluminum, might not bring back manufacturing jobs now. Why? Because if manufacturing comes back to the United States, it's going to come back in a very capital-intensive way and not so much in a labor-intensive way. And so let me show you a little bit of evidence of that in the next few pictures. So this next picture I'm showing you, I think I took out one picture by mistake. But what I should have showed you here is manufacturing output has actually gone up in the United States over the 2000s. So if we actually see, is the US producing more manufacturing goods than it did in 2000, in 2017? And the answer is unambiguously yes. We're about 7%. The GDP in real terms has gone up in the manufacturing sector. So that's first story number 1. It's not that we're just displacing jobs to the rest of the world, because we're still producing more manufacturing goods. We're just doing it with much less labor. So the picture I'm showing you here is what we would refer to as the labor share in the manufacturing sector. So if we measure all of the revenues that go to manufacturing and then ask what fraction of those go to workers. So take the wage bill in manufacturing and divide it by the sales in manufacturing, that's this number I'm showing you. And that's the black line. The blue line is for all sectors in the economy, inclusive of manufacturing. And you can see the labor share in manufacturing is plummeting relative to other sectors. What does this mean? It basically means workers are just less important in the manufacturing sector than they were before, particularly relative to other sectors. Okay? Why? Consistent with this next picture. This next picture is the capital intensity of the manufacturing sector. So just value the machines and value the workers and take the ratio of the two. And you can see the value of the machines in manufacturing versus the value of machines in all other sectors were trending similarly up to about 2000. And then you see this big break where manufacturing is moving towards machines relative to workers in the production of their goods. And what this means now is if, again, we bring back manufacturing jobs to the United States, it is now coming back in a way that it is much more capital intensive than it was in the past. Coupled with that, the manufacturing sector is becoming much more a skilled sector relative to where it was in the past. So this is a data instead of levels of manufacturing jobs. The data is in the share of workers working in manufacturing. So it's like the numerator divided by the denominator and of how big the population is for different skill groups. So again, I'm doing this for men. I'm doing this 21 to 55, and I'm doing it by my 3 education groups. And the first thing that should stick out to you when you look at this picture is in 1980, 30%, 1/3 of all men with a high school degree or less worked in the manufacturing sector. This was the primary sector for men, prime age, with less years of education. Okay? So when this sector goes away, it has a big effect on this group of workers. And you can see that the share of men working in manufacturing with a high school degree or less is plummeting over time. Now it is for high-skilled men too, those with a bachelor's degree or more or some college in between, those have been declining as well. But the declines have not been as steep. And you can see it used to be that most of the manufacturing sector was low-skilled young men. Now, they're kind of even. So what does that imply? The manufacturing sector is becoming more educated. As more men in general have become educated, and the difference between educated and less educated men has narrowed, that means manufacturing is now becoming more and more skilled over time relative to what was in the past. So we're seeing these two things. Machines are in manufacturing, and to the extent that workers in manufacturing, they're disproportionately becoming more skilled over time, means that if these manufacturing jobs might come back, they might have not the same effect on the labor market as they did when they left. Now, how do I show you causally that the manufacturing sector is actually resulting in declining employment rates in the United States? So let me show you what I do in a lot of my research is I exploit some regional variation. So what I'm showing you here is a manufacturing intensity in 2000 in a variety of areas we call commuting zones. Think about this as a metropolitan area, slightly bigger. This is an area where there's 700 and some of them that we've defined in the United States, not just me, the Bureau of Labor Statistics defines. And people in that area disproportionately work in those areas. Okay? And the dark red is the intensity of the manufacturing sector for all individuals 21 to 55 men and women. So the dark red means about 20 to 35% of all individuals aged 21 to 55 work in manufacturing in that area. The light areas means there's very few people working in manufacturing in those areas. And what do you see? Places like Nevada has very little manufacturing. Places like Florida has little manufacturing. Florida has a lot of tourism. Okay, Disney World's there. But the Midwest, very manufacturing intensive. So then I'm going to ask, what happened to the employment rate in Detroit relative to the employment rate in Orlando during this time period as manufacturing went away? Okay. And I'm not going to do just Detroit and Orlando. We're going to do it for every 700 and some commuting zones over this period. And so you could get pictures like this. So this first picture is just showing you, it's not surprising, that the places that were most manufacturing intensive in 2000 were also the places that had the biggest decline in manufacturing employment in 2000. So on the y-axis is the percentage point decline in the manufacturing share for prime age workers, both men and women. The x-axis is how intensive manufacturing was. When manufacturing goes away, it disproportionately hurt Detroit relative to Orlando in terms of the share of people working in manufacturing. Not surprising. Next picture is what I'm really after. So this picture shows us the same y-axis we had before, but now on the x-axis, the share of manufacturing that declined in the region between 2000 and today. Okay? So our Detroits are over here, our Orlando's over here. The size of the circle is just how big the metropolitan area is. Okay? LA and Chicago are bigger than Peoria. Okay? That's all they're trying to measure there. The y-axis is, what is the fraction of men working who are prime age in those areas? So this is the employment rate. Okay, the numerator is how many men are employed. The denominator is how many men there are. Again, for 21 to 55-year-olds. And you can see the places that had the biggest manufacturing decline had by far disproportionately the biggest declines in employment. So when you see these declining employment rates that I showed you in the early slides, they are not homogeneous across places in the country. The places that had the biggest declines were the places that were manufacturing intensive. And you can see just your eye for a scatter. You don't need a regression. You don't need anything from this. There is a strong downward sloping relationship between declining employment propensities and the initial manufacturing share. This is for men. Here's the same picture for women. The slope of these lines are roughly identical, even though the scale might make you bump around a little bit much. But basically, in places where manufacturing was, the employment rates in those places were falling sharply. So when you start thinking about current both economic and political economic stories about where a populist movement might be coming from, you could see the places in your mind where you think such a populist movement might be coming from are the places that used to be heavily endowed in manufacturing, and those jobs went away, and those workers are now sitting idle with a much higher propensity they did in the past. Now there's a whole bunch of fancy economic stuff we could do to try to get exogenous variation, to try to tease out a causal effect on manufacturing on local employment rates, taking into account that the people could move across places. It doesn't change the tenor that right now people in the industrial Midwest and the industrial Southeast are having much lower employment rates than their counterparts in the rest of the country. And using just those regression coefficients that I showed you before, about 1/3 to 1/2 of the decline in employment rates in hours worked in the United States between 2000 and 2017, I could trace causally back to the decline in the manufacturing sector. The effects are, again, similar for young and old. The effects are close to zero for those of us with a bachelor's degree or more. The effects are much higher for those of us with less amounts of skill. Again, takeaway that the manufacturing sector is really putting a drag on employment. Now, the question we might want to ask then is why? So why is it that when a sector goes away, we stop working as opposed to moving to another sector? 100 years ago, essentially all of us were farmers. Okay, a little bit, maybe 120 years ago. Technology came along, a tractor, and killed the farming sector. But yet, employment rates didn't go to zero when the farming sector went away. So why is it now that when we have a sector that disappears, you're getting a very sluggish reallocation of labor to other sectors? And there's a couple of stories in the background that I have in mind that I want to tease out, and some I'll show you. I don't know what I showed you here, but I'm going to tell you some stories. I might show you one of them in the next slides. But story number one and it's basically going to be point 2 on my slide, is when farming went away, people moved to manufacturing. In the skill requirements for a farmer and the skill requirements to working in manufacturing were very similar. In farming, I dug a hole. In manufacturing, I pulled a lever. And those two skill sets were very complementary. My dad was a manufacturer his whole life. My guess, if he was born in 1870, he would have been a farmer. The skill set my dad had in 1982 was very similar to the skill set that would have made him a successful farmer in 1882. But now, when manufacturing goes away, and the sectors that are growing in the economy tend to be in the more cognitive service sector, healthcare, or even the service sector in general, a greeter at Walmart. The skill requirements that manufacturing had, that my dad had, doesn't translate well to telling people hi and smiling when they walk into Walmart. So that kind of skill adjustment might be more difficult in current environments than it did in the past. Couple that with the fact that manufacturing is becoming a more skilled sector, that might make the transitions a little harder than it did in the past. Relatedly, and we talked about this earlier, when you get close to starving, you will work. And in 1882, government programs weren't that developed, if at all, and when farming went away, you had a choice. You could starve, or you could reallocate, and people reallocated. And now, there are margins of adjustment that might be easier to allow people to not work relative to work. Disability is one of them. And so, if you go to the data and ask where have disability rates increased the most between 2000 and 2017 for prime age workers, so take out the people over the age of 55, it is these areas in the industrial Midwest and the industrial Southeast. So you are seeing a movement towards disability being a long-term employment insurance option for those workers displaced with manufacturing. It doesn't explain all the story, but it explains a chunk on how they eat when these jobs went away. And the last thing I just want to talk about, and we'll summarize, because I know we got to move to video game. How much? We got time. I don't know. You guys got to go to class, right? I got nothing this afternoon. Okay, so I'll move along a little bit. So let me just show you one last picture, and then we'll move to the labor supply story. You hear a lot of news in the paper about the opioid epidemic occurring in the economy, the country as a whole. Now, with that, there's a discussion, rightfully so, that about increased prescription patterns on the part of doctors at large contributed to this opioid epidemic. I believe in that wholeheartedly. We'll think about that as opioid supply. Opioid demand, though, is that people might want opioids when there's certain economic conditions occur. The two interact to give you an equilibrium. What I'm showing here is where current prescription opioid use is the highest as of 2015. You can see the West in some of these kind of western counties where there's not a lot of people in these counties, you see some opioid use. Whereas the other most intensive opioid use is currently in the industrial Midwest and the industrial Southeast. And if we just correlate our manufacturing decline with opioid use, you see, again, in a correlation sense, there is a strong relationship. So if doctors were increasing the supply nationally, the take-up rate seems to be higher in places that are currently were formerly in manufacturing hotbeds. And if we just, again, simple correlation. You don't even have to know what these kind of regressions were. Just look at the ones I've shown you here. This is basically saying the places where manufacturing fell the most is the places where drug deaths and opioid deaths have actually increased the most in the data. So having, this amplification mechanism, if under the current environment you lose your job, you move towards some sort of solace through opioids are addictive, that could then provide some, what we call in the profession, hysteresis, slow adjustment to the manufacturing shocks relative to where it was in the past. Again, there's nothing causal about what I'm showing you here, but it is an interesting correlate in the data when we're starting to think about this opioid epidemic. It is concentrated in places that used to have certain types of jobs, and those jobs seem to have disappeared. Okay, so on the summary of the first part, I do believe labor demand stories are predominant. I do believe the manufacturing sector is particularly important, particularly for less educated workers. And I do believe that we are seeing a huge amount of policies in current environments to promote the manufacturing sector, whether it be trade policies through tariffs, whether it be trade policy through being part of trade groups, whether it be industrial policy in general, or environmental policy that basically wants to support coal workers in certain areas. I don't believe those policies will bring back manufacturing jobs, even if they bring back the manufacturing sector. Because when manufacturing sector comes back, it is coming back as a capital-intensive, high-skilled sector, and it left as a relatively low-skilled, less capital-intensive sector. And I don't think we're going to see the same bang for the buck on the job side with these types of policies. It's technology now, not trade, that is causing these differences. So let's flip to the other side, labor supply. I see some people in this room. Okay. Played a video game or two in their day, myself included. So how do we think about what's going on? And this is it's going to be a young man story, even more than a young woman story when I show you the data. I am puzzled why young men have stopped working. Historically, when shocks happen, including labor demand shocks, it is the young that adjust the most. And the fact that young, in particularly young men, I didn't show you the trends and hours for young women, it doesn't look like the decline in young men. There's something about young men that is different relative to other periods, different relative to young women and older men, and large by historical standards that is going on in current environments. And that has me puzzled. So we talked a little bit. What I want to think about now is what is the effect of increased leisure technology on the labor supply of young men by raising the reservation wage. So again, changes in the reservation wage might have occurred for centuries. TV came along, and that was more enjoyable than listening to the radio. Listening to the radio came along, and I don't know, whittling a stick. What did people do before that? I have no idea what enjoyment was prior to that. But in doing so, technology has always happened. So why is it now that technology might have an effect? Well, it interacts with our labor demand story. In a world where technology is raising market wages and technology is raising reservation wages, the effect on labor supply could be relatively small. But in a world where market wages are flat and then the value of not working is going up, you now might get more people who are on the margin of work versus not, and as a result, that could have a labor supply effect. And so what has come along right around the same time the Great Recession started was huge advances in leisure technology, primarily consumed by the young and disproportionately consumed by young men. And I'll show you that in a second. All of you are familiar with some of these, but you will not imagine. Back in the day, I was even young. Had more hair here, less hair here. And what happening then was, there was no social media or video. The video games I had with Frogger, and it was, you might be able to get 30 minutes before your wrist hurt because you had to move this big joystick around, and it wasn't quite as enjoyable as the thing my son plays for almost 23 hours a day if he was unconstrained. And same with social media, and all of those things basically took off somewhere around the mid-2000s to 2010, 11 through today. So let me show you a little bit of how you all spend your time. So when I ask people through time series, not me, the Bureau of Labor Statistics runs nationally representative time diaries. They can measure how people allocate their time across different categories. So some of those categories, how much you're studying, how much you're going to work, how much you're cleaning your dorm room or your room in general, how much you're washing your kids. But there's also a series of leisure categories. And so I'm now going to show you what has happened to those leisure categories for different groups, men, women, young, and old, from the mid-2000s when this data started to current periods. The leisure categories I'm going to show you are these 5. Let me just focus on the second one for a moment. This is anything you spend on the computer for leisure activities. Okay, if you're writing a paper on the computer, that's in a different category. That's in homework. Okay, if you're paying your bills online, that's a different category. You're watching Netflix, that's a different category too. I'm going to call that just TV watching or movie watching or streaming of some sort of programs. So this is basically anything you do on the computer for leisure activities. That's going to include things like time on your smartphone as well. And it's going to include things like video games and emailing your friends and surfing the web in general, Facebook, etc. Okay. Video games is a component of this I'm going to break out and just show you separate data on just the video game subcomponent of this category. And then there's a, yeah, what do you got?
Quick question with that. It seems like there's a super fine line. So sometimes you're doing work on Facebook,
Yeah.
right? And then you switch and you like watch a dog video, right?
Yeah.
I'm curious as to how this picks up on
It
that.
is hard to do multitasking. So the way it is tell me what you did yesterday in 10-minute intervals. So they ask you to recall 24 hours in neat, detailed categories, and it's how you would respond. Now, if you were basically responded that I was basically doing some work on the computer and watching dog videos in a given time, it proportions half and half. Okay? But most of the time, it probably is going to underrepresent the actual amount of leisure time that we're taking on. So another category for older workers is commuting. Okay? They sit on the train and get to work. Oftentimes when they're on the train, they're also consuming some leisure activities, maybe reading a book, maybe playing a game. My guess is when you ask people what they were doing, they would say commuting. Okay? There are often times I'm at dinner with my wife, and she would say she's at dinner with me. But I am pretty sure she is checking Facebook for half the damn time. So those kind of things now with the technology allows you to do that a little bit more easily than the past. I think it might actually underrepresent some of the trends. Okay. Okay, and then so the other categories, just as a benchmark, it's going to be TV, socializing. There's another leisure category which includes everything else. These are small activities like exercise and sports, reading, just chilling. That's a category. So we're going to clump all those together. Dating and stuff is in socializing, and then we're going to part of sleep and eating and personal care. There's a biological component to that, but there's also a leisure component that we sleep in on the weekends. So I'm just going to clump some of those together as well. That's not as important. The key thing I want you to focus on is this is our young men, again, of all educations. Leisure's gone up by about 2.5 hours per week. So the way the data comes to me is hours per day. I multiply it by 7 to give you a measure of hours per week. If you could multiply that by roughly 50 to get weeks per year, or hours per year, that's roughly in the same ballpark that we were talking about in terms of the decline in hours that I showed you before in the earlier slides. About 130 hours per year have fallen for these men. Leisure has gone up by 130 hours. They're not switching to home production or studying or anything else like that as a first approximation. Of that increase, a chunk of it, 2 of the 2.5 hours, is just in computer leisure activities for these young men. Okay? And about 1.5 of that is just the video game component. So in the back of your mind, the amount of time we've increased in video games for young men is about 100 hours per year over this time period. Market work fell by 160 hours or something like that for this group, 150 hours, and they're just moving it almost 1-to-1 for video games during this time. Not quite 1-to-1, but in the rough approximation. This is a hugely intensive activity. And if you're not working, so this is the same group I'm showing you now, but not working, in recent periods, they're spending about 10 hours a week. The average man is about 10 hours per week on video games. The amount of time on exercise and sport, like 2 hours per week. The amount of time of all other combined socialization, about 8 hours per week. Okay, TV watching, just as a benchmark, is like 16 hours per week for this group. So this is a massive activity. And the key thing that I want to make sure you realize is this is just what you did yesterday. For most people, they didn't do anything yesterday on the computer. So for those who did it, they did it extremely intensively. So this is now, I've gone from hours to week to hours per day. The average man, conditional young man doing this, was about 3.5 hours per day. Okay? With about, I'd say about 10% of them doing more than 4 or 5 hours per day. This is a highly intensive activity. I'm done, 5 minutes? I'll be done. Okay, I know they got to go to class. It'll be fine. So now, oh, what about for the other groups? So now I'm just showing you 3 other groups. Older men, younger women, and older women. The top line is the change in their leisure. Okay. Again, young men had the biggest increase in leisure. They had the biggest decline in market hours. That makes sense with the data I showed you before. How much did computer time go up for old men? 0. Okay. That is me. I got to be honest. I play a little with my son, but he doesn't even let me play anymore. He's like, Dad, no, we're fine. At one point, we could like play Mario Kart together or something like now, but now he's playing like Madden and other games and stuff. And he says, I just want to do it myself, Dad. I'm like, fair enough. Okay. But then the young women, they increased about, again, for men, remember that number is about 1.9 hours per week. Young women also increased their time on computer activity. All of it is on the social media component, and the other computer part, essentially none of it is on the computer games, on average. Now, again, some of you in this room might, but on average, it is rare relative to the trends in men. And again, men, 1.4 hours per week shift in that over this time period. And older women is somewhere in between. So how do you tease out? This is the last thing I'll say, and then I'll summarize. So how do you tease out whether young men are playing video games because they got nothing better to do, or because young men have not working because of the advent of video games? So how do you deal with that identification issue? And the way we do that is we use a little bit of structure and a little bit of economics to infer how much young men would play video games if they didn't have anything better to do. So let me show you just in words what we do. Think about this as the x-axis is basically how much leisure time you have. The y-axis is how much time you're playing video games. And suppose we get this relationship that says, if you don't work, how much is your video game time going to come up? And I'm going to estimate this from the data. How do I estimate this from the data? I use cross-region variation during the Great Recession. And if you're in Nevada and you lost your job relative to me in Texas, I could trace out how much more video games you played in Nevada than me in Texas relative to each other, with the assumption that the video game technology was the same between the two of us. Xbox was in both places. And I do that systematically across all regions during the Great Recession and after the Great Recession, and I trace out the slope of this line for young men of about 2, which says when young men lose their job and leisure goes up by an hour, 1%, not an hour, 1%, computer time goes up by 2%. Okay. And then I go to the data in the time series where we all had this big change in leisure technology and say, how much did leisure go up between the beginning of my sample period and the end of the sample period? And it went up by about 4%. And then I want to ask, if I have this slope of this line that tells me when I lose my job, I pay for every 1% more in video game leisure, I play 2% in video game time, I should see aggregate video game time go up by 8%. 4% increase in leisure with a slope of 2, I should see an 8% increase in leisure. In the data, leisure goes up by, or video game time goes up by 50%, 50. So the only way the model could reconcile that is if something about video games was becoming more attractive to these young men than it was before. And so that's how we measure out the video game technology has gotten really attractive for young men and young women and old men and older women. Last thing I'll say is then we use a structure of our model, a labor supply elasticity that determines how much we work when our wage changes, which the same theory says how much I'll work when my reservation wage changes, and then I infer how much you change in your work effort when your reservation changes because a leisure good becomes more attractive. And that's what we do in the paper. Now, when I do this out, we could explain roughly, I don't know, I would say something about 1/5 to 2/5 of the decline in hours for young men during this time period. Okay? It's not a huge amount. It depends a lot on how we assume their consumption is insured, etc. But the key thing in the back of your mind is it closes some of the gap between young men and older men. Doesn't even close it all. So it basically says the video game story might be able to shrink some of the gap between young men and older men. For young women, we get a small effect too, but it is relatively small, and the decline relative young women relative to old women in hours, conditional on skill, wasn't that much to begin with as well. So this is really a young men phenomenon, and it explained their decline was so massive. So when I tell you, even if it does a quarter of their decline, that still just takes them slightly closer to their older men counterparts during this time period. So last thing I'll say is then we ask these young men who aren't working, are they happier now than they were a decade ago? And they say, yes, we are, thank you. So the actual happiness rates, if you use surveys to measure young men's happiness, is actually gone up during the 2000s, where older men do not. And again, as I should have said earlier, young men are now cohabitating with their parents with a much greater ferocity than they did before. Some of you might know some people who are hanging out in their parents' basement. The data kind of represents that for both young men and some for young women as well. Okay. So technology, effect on labor demand, particularly through the manufacturing sector. Technology, some effect on labor supply by making leisure more attractive, particularly for young men, raising the reservation wage. Those combined factors are explaining some of the patterns that I showed you at the beginning. But I just want to end with this one thing. Those patterns I showed you at the beginning are massive declines. And so when you start viewing the lens of the macroeconomic landscape going forward, you have to remember two things. One, the position from which you are in is different than most of the population. Most young people and older people don't look like you in terms of their accumulated skill.
This side.
Second, for those with less accumulated skill, their lives are very different in the 2000s relative to the past. And when you hear things like the unemployment rate is low, that does not mean the employment rate is high. And there is a large swath of prime age individuals who historically worked a lot that are now sitting idle. And when you view current events through the lens, both economic and political, I think that might give you a different perspective on where things are coming from. Okay, that's all I got. I'm done. Questions? Do I got time for questions? I got anything? What time is it? I don't even. 5 minutes for questions. This is wonderful. Look at that. I had 5 more minutes to talk about stuff. Look at this. I think I got to do the microphones now. How was the cookies? Was the cookie good? That was
Great,
That's the one I had. That was a good cookie.
Do you
What
think
got?
one takeaway for this is that when designing a welfare system, now since leisure is so attractive, you need to be very careful to place incentives to actually spend time searching for a job if you want people to get themselves off your welfare system?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a judgmental component. So if leisure is getting more attractive and people aren't working, but they're happy taking leisure, in terms of a welfare, so that might be a good thing. Mm-hmm. But if we think there are some externality of that on the rest of us, or we think that there might be some dynamic inconsistency. When you're 20, you might like taking leisure, but if you're now 30 and you have a kid, maybe you can't feed them with Udall's the video game time. And if it's harder to get a job when you're 30 not working in your 20s, that could be an issue that people might not internalize. Then we might want to think about way of spurring work. So promoting job search is a good way to do that. Also just things like the earned income tax credit, which actually increases the return to work itself relative to not work, is another policy that you could use to do that. And human capital investment is my third. So all three of those are policies that I'm a big fan of. So things like subsidizing job training, if you think that's the friction that is preventing people from getting skill. Other questions? What do we got? We got one back there.
Was there any effect on the labor employment? So was there any effect from the 2003 war on the employment of young men? Or is there...
The military component?
Yeah.
Yeah, so military is a small component of this. Everything I showed you today is excluding the military. The sector actually shrunk some during this time period in terms of the share of young men in the military. The military is also getting more capital intensive over time. And so to the extent that there's not much of a trend, it affects all the levels of the pictures I showed you, because they're neither in my numerator or denominator, but it won't affect the trend too much when I include I should be even clear on this. I was going to say something that wasn't quite precise. The military does. One thing that is missing from what I'm showing you is the institutionalized population, prisons, and we know there's been a massive trend in that category. So if you want to actually measure the fraction of people who aren't working, it becomes even more dramatic if I include the prisons in the numerator and the denominator. The military, it's small relative to prisons, and they're not much of a trend. The prisons, there's much bigger trend and bigger levels in that. Other questions? Last one. What do we got?
How has the structure of employment, the job market has changed? How has the structure of the job market has changed over years, and how has the transition is interacting with the decision of not working or go to work?
Yeah, so I think the job market has changed in many ways. We've talked about one today, which is on the skill dimension. So the skill requirements in the labor market have changed dramatically. We used to pull levers, and now we don't. So sometimes people refer to this as the routinization of the job market or the cognitive load of the job market. It used to be very routine, and now it's much more cognitive thinking. And those skill mixes at an individual level are very different. So that's one. Another big change, which we haven't talked about, is at-will employment contract, Uber, okay, which now provides another benefit in the sense that I could do something that I have a skill for, drive around, without having to meet a lot of hurdles, and that does provide some sort of employment opportunities for some. So there's been massive changes around there. The stuff I focus on now a lot is on the skill dimension. Sam, wrap us up.
Yep. Okay, I have two small housekeeping things, but first, please join me in thanking Erik for that fabulous presentation.
Thank you.